Sorry about all that. Sometimes there's all this clerical and bookkeeping work takes some time. All right, so we are starting out on our Gita from Zero. As I mentioned before, I'm going to video these sessions and they will be uploaded on YouTube. And because they'll be uploaded on YouTube, you can see them after the fact, or if you miss one, you can go back. And there's going to be a sequence to them. So the sequence will be, that each one will build off the previous one. And because it's building off the previous one, it's kind of like we're stepping through things. And since they're as eternal as things get, they're up there on YouTube, you'll be able to look through them. I'm also going to make these quite into shorter segments. Like I told everybody earlier, there'll be 2 segments today with a kirtan in between. Maybe the kirtan will be really short because we've lost so much time. But that's the basic plan that I hope to do today. And what I want to start with here is a look at where we're going with this. Let me see, how do I... Okay, so we've seen most of this, Gita from Zero. Have you ever heard of Bhagavad-Gita? Why? So this was the section that I already did on the internet. If you haven't seen that, I'll give you the link to all the previous ones so you can go visit them, or you can visit my Forest Dwellers, one word, Forest Dwellers, and then space, and then number 108. If you do that, you'll see all my videos, but that might be too much overwhelming because I have a lot of them from upstairs on Thursdays, so that's there too. So we will try to do this every Wednesday, but 2 Wednesdays from now, I had already made a schedule with the Bhakti Center, so I'm speaking there instead of being here, so that day won't be here, but we'll get to that. So the first thing we're going to start is, as I mentioned, if you look at Prabhupada's purport, or his Bhagavad-Gita rather, that's what I'm trying to say, the Bhagavad-Gita as it is, you'll see that the Bhagavad-Gita as it is has a long introduction. And so before you read Bhagavad-Gita, you go through many, many pages of introduction. And so in a similar way, I felt the necessity to go through an introduction as well, so that when people get introduced to the Bhagavad-Gita, when they first start hearing about it, then a lot of things will more easily click into your mind, It won't be quite so mysterious. Prabhupada did it, and I'm going to kind of follow a similar thing. However, each session, even when we're doing the introductions, I'm going to pull out one verse at least of Bhagavad Gita, so you won't feel like you came here from Bhagavad Gita, you're getting philosophy or something like that instead. So, but we have to talk about philosophy, so it's easier to understand Bhagavad Gita. And what I'll do is I will speak for a little while, and then I will ask for feedback or questions. And what I might do also is just stop in the middle right after I've said something and see if anybody remembers what I just said. So I might ask you, what did I just say? So the reason I do this too, that when I listen to other people speak, I zone out into some other world, it's easy to do. So this keeps the mind's gears in connection, so we don't just get in neutral for a while, start thinking about prasadam or whatever it is, So this is kind of a thing that in general, people who do teaching are aware of that. It's easy to just kind of space out. So what I'm trying to do is prevent that. Not that, I mean, I'm there with you. I also space out in classes, so I'm struggling against the same issues as well. It's not like I'm on some high horse here. So we're going to start with an introduction, and that's what we were doing here. And as I said before on the first introductional segment on YouTube, that we're not going to use the usual thing of going through verse by verse, that rather we will go section by section through the Bhagavad-Gita, and we're going to talk a little bit about Western philosophical biases that we might have, because we all come from mostly a Western background. Maybe as we go along, we'll meet some people who come from an Indian background, but even people coming from an Indian background have also been fairly well marinated in Western philosophy, so those issues will be there as well. So we went through this, and I will talk about, seeing Gita against the backdrop of materialism, which is the way that we have to come in contact with Gita. We're in a world that's full of a materialistic sort of atheistic philosophy, which is built on a lot of philosophy that came before, in our Western world. And we're going to see it against that. So this is why I'm hoping to give Bhagavad Gita in a historical perspective, in a philosophical perspective, in a religious perspective, and also in a scientific perspective, because all these things are how we will come in contact with the Gita. And I'm trying to keep these really short, bite-sized nuggets, if I can possibly do that, which is totally against my nature, but I'll see how closely I can manage it. We're already way off time. But this is our first section. This is going to be section 2, so that's the number there. These are eventually, when we start going through the Gita chapters, this will be 01 for chapter 1, 02 for chapter 2, and 12 for chapter 12. And this will be the session, not the verse, but the session. So that's how it'll work. And this, by the way, is the date, if you haven't figured it out. But it's in YMD format, not in MDY format as usual, so that it sorts nicely. Today this is part 1, which is where we're going to do today. Gita excerpt we're going to do, then we're going to do many editions of Gita as it is, and philosophical subfields. So this is what we're going to do in this little section. I'm hoping that I can keep this to 30 minutes or thereabouts. We'll see how I get on with this. So here we go. So here's our little first Gita segment. This is from 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Raja Vijja Rajaguyam Pavitram Idam Uttamam Pratyat Savagamam Dharmyam Shushukam Kartamavyayam. This is what Krishna says about transcendental knowledge. This is Krishna's explanation of transcendental knowledge. This knowledge is the king of education, the most secret of all secrets. It is the purest knowledge, and because it gives direct perception of the self by realization, it is the perfection of religion. It is everlasting and is joyfully performed. So there's a mouthful there. There's a mouthful there. It's the king of education, so of all kinds of knowledge, it's the most important kind of knowledge. It is secret. Most people don't know it. That pretty much stands to reason. We don't have to, convince anybody of that. It is the purest knowledge, and because it gives direct perception of the self by realization, it is the perfection of religion. So here we're learning that it is the best of religious knowledge, and it is everlasting and joyfully performed. So joyfully performed is there too. So susukam, that's joyful, by the way. So any quick questions about that verse from anybody in the room? We'll give a second here to see if something bubbles up. If not, okay, but if yes, then we'll, yeah.
How can we know
Wait, where's our microphone guy? Oh. Well, it's all right.
Okay. How can we know about it if it's so secret?
Right.
Yeah.
So it is secret to the general people, but it is not secret to those who make an effort to learn it. So Krishna is teaching it to Arjuna. Later on in Bhagavad Gita, we will hear that because you are not envious of me, I am giving you this transcendental knowledge. That's what Krishna is saying. So the opposite applies, that if someone is envious or not devoted, they won't get this knowledge. That's why it's secret. It's not that Krishna wants it to be secret, but there is a price for it. And people who aren't willing to pay the price, then it'll stay secret from them. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It seems that like there is more to say about it.
Oh yeah.
I understand like a little bit. Yeah.
That's another thing.
It gives hope also that
What's
it gives hope that it's not totally secret. That
right.
You might be able to learn it sort of.
In fact, it is, Krishna explains in the 10th chapter of Bhagavad Gita that, I give the knowledge by which they can understand me to those who are constantly devoted and worshiping me with love. I give the understanding by which they can come to me. So Krishna actually does that. So if we have the desire to come in contact with Krishna, then he will help a person to understand Bhagavad Gita and this knowledge. So that's there. Again, the only real qualification is that you're not envious and you're trying to follow the process. If you're following the process and you're not envious, then it'll work out. Okay, so we've had our actual Bhagavad Gita verse today. This was one that I pulled out because it's kind of relevant to our subject for today. And what you're going to find in this run-through that we're doing today is that I will probably cut some explanations a little shorter than I will others. And the reason I will do that is because some things will get a little too deep in the weeds. And I do plan to discuss them at a later time. And so we're kind of trying to take it really quick, really sort of basically get into it in short, sort of bite-sized segments. So, as I mentioned in Prabhupada's introduction, if you read the introduction of Bhagavad Gita, this is what Prabhupada says in paragraph 7. Recently, an American lady asked me to recommend an English translation of Bhagavad Gita. Of course, in America, there's so many editions of Bhagavad Gita available in English. But as far as I have seen, not only in America, but also in India, none of them can be strictly said to be authoritative because in almost every one of them, the commentator has expressed his own opinions without touching the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. So this is the first thing that I want to kind of pull out from our explanation of Bhagavad Gita is expressed own opinion without touching the spirit of Bhagavad Gita. This is why the Bhagavad Gita has, Prabhupada mentioned something like it, even at the time when he was still with us on this planet, there was some ridiculous number, like 500 versions of Bhagavad Gita, and so although all these versions are available off the presses in the bookstores, in the libraries, Prabhupada didn't recommend them. And the reason he didn't was because they didn't touch the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, to touch the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita is not an easy thing to do. What we need to recognize is that we are going to look a little bit at what it means to touch the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita and why we don't recommend any of these other versions of the Bhagavad Gita. And that's why Prabhupada's Gita is called, as we all know, as it is. So that is a very important part of it, and that's exactly what Prabhupada means by the phrase as it is, that it's Bhagavad Gita on Bhagavad Gita's own terms, not Bhagavad Gita in some other way. And we'll talk about that in segment 2 here in a minute. But right now, as a preparation to the next segment, we're going to do a little bit of talk about philosophy. I don't know if you all have ever made any real look or had any classes or had any instruction about the nature of philosophy. Now, this is from a Western perspective. We'll hit it both from a Vedic and a Western perspective, because when you start talking about philosophy, there's a lot of similarity between at least the way philosophy is structured as the way of explaining it or teaching it in both systems. So there's a lot of carryover or crossover. So these are what are called philosophical subfields. There's metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, which is ethics and morality, aesthetics, logic, language, theology, etiology, eschatology, and politics. I'm not going to explain what all those subcategories are, but when we talk about philosophy, what do we generally mean? In a nutshell, philosophy is thinking about thinking. So, it sounds kind of crazy to say, but that's basically what it is. Philosophy means thinking about thinking. So what we're learning with philosophy is how to think in ways that are structured so that they aren't useless, or they don't give us the tendency to come up with ideas that are completely wrong. So now this is kind of an important thing, that for philosophy, any philosophy, whether it's your philosophy or Christian philosophy or atheistic philosophy or scientific philosophy or the philosophy of Socrates or the philosophy of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, or the philosophy of whoever or wherever or whenever you want to mention. If it's a complete philosophy, it should have all these different things. But most philosophies don't. Most philosophies are missing many of these points. For instance, the philosophy of Socrates. Basically, Socrates mostly was right here at value theory. He taught about morality and ethics. That's mostly what Socrates was about. And for that matter, Jesus is more or less in the same category, that he did not explain much about metaphysics, epistemology, and since neither of these two philosophies have much in those categories, then later people had to add in all the missing pieces, because all philosophies will eventually have to deal with these issues, because if your philosophy doesn't have an explanation of metaphysics or epistemology or language, then people are going to ask you questions about that. And if they do, and you don't have any answers, you look foolish. And that's why, of course, Socrates lived a long time ago, and eventually his pupil, Plato, did fill in some more. And later on, Aristotle filled in some more. And similarly in Christianity, the Christians had to fill in all the missing pieces. And they did. Mostly they borrowed from Greek philosophy as that went on later on. So, however, with the Vedas, this stuff was built in from day one, all of it, it's all there, there's discussion of metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, about politics. Eschatology, by the way, is the science of where everything's going to wind up. What's the end of it all? Is there an end of it all? Etiology is where did it all come from? The origins of everything. Theology is, of course, is there not a God? If so, what's the nature of that God? If you look in places like Wikipedia, you will see some of these things not listed, because it depends on how complete you want to discuss about philosophy. All right, so I'm going to give you all a chance to ask if there are any questions about this two bits. So we're going to go back over it here real quick. We just talked about this idea of as it is, that Prabhupada expressed that the Gita was being commented on or explained by people who did not actually touch the real spirit of it. They had some other thing in mind. And then we discussed this idea of as it is, that Prabhupada wrote this Bhagavad-Gita to be in the spirit. Now, we didn't exactly explain what we mean by being in the spirit of the Bhagavad-Gita, but we see that Prabhupada has this idea that Gita has a message or a theme, and most people ignore that message or theme, but they still comment on Bhagavad-Gita. And then we talked about these philosophical subfields. So, questions from the group here? Yes. We've got our microphone runner here. No. He's going to hold it for you. Because I found that when people try to speak and hold it, they do weird things. So sorry about that.
No problem. What is epistemology?
What's that?
What is epistemology?
Okay, epistemology is a very important part of philosophy. We will discuss all these things in detail as this, group of talks goes on. But to give you a Reader's Digest nickel tour, epistemology is the study of the nature, extent, and origin of knowledge. That's essentially how they usually describe it. The nature, extent, and origin of knowledge. When we say knowledge, what are we talking about? What does that word actually mean? The extent. How much can we actually know about the world around us? Philosophers throughout the years, including in India, have always recognized that there is a certain sort of mysterious nature about the world that we live in, that it's not straightforward. So we know things, but we only know them to some extent, because there's a cloudiness, a fogginess about it. So epistemology studies that. And origin is, where does it come from? So nature, extent, and origin of knowledge. So this is quite, today, usually when people talk about philosophy, they really hone in on this epistemology. In the Greek days and in the medieval times, they mostly focused in on value theory and ethics, but these days it's mostly epistemology. People loathe metaphysics these days. Nobody has any real idea of aesthetics, art and music, what's good or what's not good. People don't talk about this much. Logic was big about a century ago. Now people don't talk about it much, other than that you have to have it. They don't explain what it is or how it works. And of course, theology doesn't exist in most modern philosophy because there's no God as far as that's concerned. So that's kind of a brief overview. Any other questions?
What about language?
What's that?
What about language?
Language, right. So it may not seem immediately apparent, but language is a very important part of philosophy. The reason is that when we say something, what do we mean by it? Sometimes a thing a person says or a thing a person writes might have more than one meaning. And so to talk about philosophy, we have to pick apart how human language works, because we are trying to map, reality with what gets said. So that's why language is a very important part of it. Oftentimes it's lumped in with logic, so sometimes it's called semiotics, in other words.
So actually, that's the main tool for philosophy, right? The language with logic, right? So, okay.
Right.
Thank
So language and logic go together. Logic is how you make good arguments, and language is how you use words and understand what those words mean. In our part 2, we will go a little bit deeper into that. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, Maharaj, we can safely say that Bhagavad-Gita is the only philosophical literature in mankind that incorporates all the subfields of philosophy.
No, I wouldn't say that. But what I do say is it's the only one that has done so from the very beginning. Others were more or less forced to develop all these missing pieces that they had, So our Western philosophy started out mostly with ethics and a little bit of metaphysics. And then eventually it had to annex epistemology, aesthetics, logic, and so on and so forth. So if you go through our Western our Western philosophical tradition, you'll see that it didn't start out with all these categories, but later on, because of, when you talk about philosophy, there's the cultural exchange of ideas, wherever you are, that in the ancient world, there was the Greeks, and they lived in a place, and they bought and sold things with people who were from India, and they bought and sold things with people who were further north in Europe, and this and that and the other. And as a result, the exchange of ideas took place, and so people who had different ideas would ask questions. And so in our philosophy it says like this: what does your philosophy say? Over here in Asia Minor, in Turkey, we talk like this, and you Greeks talk like that. And so how do these two things relate? So if your philosophy is void in one suit, then you have to figure out, well, what do we really think about that? And in some cases, and this is what gives me great hope, when a particular philosophy is void in a particular suit, generally if somebody comes up with a good line of talk, they just buy it wholesale, because they've got nothing to lose, because it's not contradicting anything in their philosophy. That's what happened with Christianity. They bought, mostly Aristotle. And they bought big chunks of Aristotle, even though Aristotle was a materialist, basically, in many ways. So there was some parts of it that they didn't adopt, but there were other parts they did adopt. So, yes.
It's interesting that aesthetics is considered a philosophy. So you said philosophy is the thinking of thoughts, or the active thinking of thoughts. Aesthetics doesn't involve any type of words, but it's like a taste of perception.
Right.
So how does that connect with, and how has this been defined as put into a philosophy?
Right. Usually aesthetics is here with value theory. In many places, these two are considered part of the same thing. In other words, what's valuable and what isn't. So morality is a concern with what is good behavior, what isn't. And ethics is, how do human beings interact, and what is legitimate and what is out of bounds behavior. And it sort of gets into, well, what's useful or what's worthwhile in human interaction, human dealings. And so aesthetics is what is beautiful and what isn't. What is good for the soul and what's not. And as I say, this thing, aesthetics, is really dropped out of the picture in modern philosophy. But at one point, it was a pretty important part. The Greeks had definite ideas about.
I was going to say with the Greeks, I'd imagine, because they were heavy into philosophy, and they had so much like sculptures and art.
Right.
Yeah.
They had serious ideas about what was good music and what wasn't, what was good art, what wasn't, what was good architecture, what was not. And they had reasons for why, these things were good or not good, But, somewhere along the line when we get past, even as into the 17th and 18th century, still, there was quite a sense of what was good or ennobling, what was, helped humanity and what kind of pushed humanity back down, and something was like that. But you see in the modern day, this has been, completely, that no one would really give theories about aesthetics these days without being laughed at, by most people, And so we have our modern music, our modern art and all that, which is just, whatever it is what it is. If it sells, it's okay,
Yeah, there's definitely people that are like heavily into these things, but to consider them like philosophers is it's nice.
Yeah, right. So this is actually originally one of the limbs or sub-branches or subfields of philosophy. Okay, so I want, before we get too much further into this now, for all of you to pull out your phones, and I'm going to see if I can do this in a reasonable way. How do I get the URL to you now? Oh, let me okay, we do this. All right, so let's see what we've got here. Well, one of the things I neglected to mention, I always hate the fact that I didn't think about saying this, that when we do these true and false tests, we're talking about the philosophy of the Gita, of transcendental knowledge. So everything's everything. And doubtless you've heard a class somewhere, somehow, that somebody said that would say the opposite. But when you take these true and false tests, remember that what I'm trying to get at here is what was the thing that we were saying in class, like this first question, Prabhupada, in our video presentation, objected to other editions of Bhagavad-Gita because he felt they did not touch the spirit of Bhagavad-Gita as it is, Now, maybe you heard someone give a class 2 years ago, or you're a spiritual master, or somebody that you saw on YouTube said something, we can't go there, So when you answer these questions, it's true and false. So it means, what were we just talking about? If we weren't just talking about it, it's false, And if, we were just talking about it, it's in that context. So at least I'm trying to get that basic point across, Eventually I won't make that point anymore. I'll assume you all have gotten it, but we'll see. So.